This is the Gopolar GG86. It's a TKL with a translucent ABS plastic case in one of 4 colors, FR4 plate, OLED display, screwless construction, silicone mute gasket mount, and multi-layout hot swap PCB. It's available from several different vendors serving different parts of the world at different prices ranging from $94 to $149. I got mine from Keybox through Shopee Philippines for about $123 with a discount voucher. When I first heard about it, I was very enticed for a number of reasons. The OLED, my first 7U spacebar, can't be a real enthusiast if you've never used the 7U spacebar, am I right? And the multi-layout implementation to compare with the Ikki 68 Aurora. So how did the keyboard fare? Let's find out. Before we begin, let me tell you about this video's sponsor, the channel's very first, PCBWay. PCBWay is your one-stop destination for PCB-related services, including manufacturing and assembly of all kinds of PCBs for prototypes and low-volume productions. PCBWay does everything in-house, so you can expect a fast turnaround at every step of the way. Get an instant quote, get feedback about your design, and when you're ready for production, get updates and manufacturing data all in one place. They also offer other services like 3D printing and CNC machining. So head on over to PCBWay.com and turn your dream project into reality. Big thanks to PCBWay for sponsoring this video. Whenever people talk about this board, they always mention the unboxing experience. The GG86 comes in a very nice blue box with this dragon pattern in gold on the top. Pull on this tassel and you're greeted with the many included goodies. You get this beautiful metal switch puller with a purple to blue gradient, a pretty substantially long keycap puller, a USB-C cable, silicone blockers in white and black, a manual, and screw-in stabilizers. I initially used these included stabilizers but had trouble with ticking and so replaced them with Duroc V2s. The manual fits in with the theme of the whole unboxing experience alongside the box and this metal coin thing at the end of the tassel. It's all pretty nice, but in my view, ultimately meaningless. Let's go over the numerous issues I encountered with this board. First, the contents of the box were not very well secured. They were just kind of loose inside this big empty space, and so they got quite dislodged. The metal prying tool wasn't even inside its plastic sleeve anymore. Everything was also covered in these strange black particles, which I think come from the felt lining of the box. Since the parts were just loose, they probably scratched up against that lining during transit. The keyboard itself wasn't secured very well either. The top frame wasn't clipped on, and so it was able to move around. I'm about to show you some damage to this top frame, but this board was actually dropped upon receipt of delivery. I mean, like, dropped to the ground with a thud. So that's likely what caused the damage, but I can't be sure. On the bottom right of the top frame, I got this pretty big crack. These pieces underneath the top frame also snapped off. Fortunately, none of this damage affects the normal use of the keyboard. Everything still fits together well and functions without issue. Again, this was all most likely due to the fall, so you can't really blame it on the keyboard. Bottom line, don't drop your keyboards, kids. Next issue. Both the USB port and the OLED display on the PCB are crooked. The USB port skew isn't a huge issue since you're rarely looking at that part anyway, but the OLED one is pretty unfortunate. And the last issue I encountered has to do with my USB hub. I first plugged the GG86 into this hub, which does not have an external power source. It worked fine at first, but then started bugging out. The RGB was still on, but none of the key presses were registering. I then noticed that my Wi-Fi adapter, which was plugged into the same hub, had turned off. I was afraid that the keyboard may have somehow fried my hub, but a quick PC reboot confirmed that everything was still fine and well. The issue reoccurred, and that's when I plugged the keyboard directly into my PC's motherboard, and that completely eliminated the issue. The GG86 boasts a screwless design. The top frame simply snaps onto the bottom with numerous clips around its perimeter. It's very tight once it's all snapped on, which does make it quite difficult to disassemble. The included prying tool is absolutely necessary, but even with that tool, it's still really hard to get the top frame off. You really have to dig into the plastic with the metal tool, which does cause scratches and damage. Maybe I'm just stupid and I don't know how to do this properly. Feel free to educate me in the comments below. The GG86 is billed as having a silicone mute gasket mount. I've heard folks compare it to the KBD67 lights mounting, since both have silicone sheets between the PCB and plate that contain their gaskets. However, the GG86 also has a big, thick slab of silicone resting in its bottom case that is also part of the mounting. The PCB and the plate silicone rest against this slab. I don't own a Mode 65, so I can't say for sure, but it seems like the GG86's mounting is closer to that keyboard keyboard's stack mount than it is to something like the KBD67 Lite's gasket mount. We'll talk about typing feel and sound later on. Much like the Ikki 68 Aurora, the GG86 allows for multiple different layouts with hot swap. You can choose between stepped and non-stepped caps lock, split or full left and right shift, as well as ANSI or ISO enter. You can't split the backspace, and the bottom row is fixed in that Sangan layout, so you will need a 7U spacebar, as well as the corresponding 1.5U and 1U bottom row mods. As I mentioned in my video about the Ikki 68 Aurora Round 2, east and west facing switches exhibit a couple of issues. First, it is possible for them to crack the stems of keycaps, depending on the keycap and the switch. And second, there is a tilting that occurs, which is most prominent in the Ikki's ANSI pipe key. The GG86's plate has this little tab on the ANSI pipe socket that is not present on the Ikki's plates. I theorized that this may help alleviate some of that tilting, and I found that with 3-pin switches, the difference is quite significant. The GG86's pipe key does still tilt a tiny bit, but it's pretty negligible, while the Ikki's pipe tilt is very noticeable. With a 5-pin switch, the difference is much less pronounced, with both being pretty much negligible. I was quite excited to try this Sangan bottom row for some reason. It just felt like an enthusiast rite of passage to me, and I also finally got to use all the 7U spacebars in all my keycap sets. In practice, it's not really that much different from a standard bottom row, but I do think that it looks really nice on a TKL. This board comes in 4 colors, all of them translucent plastic, so the included blockers with their opaque color won't match any of them perfectly. However, I found that this wasn't too big a problem. They didn't really stick out to my eyes, and I did use the white blockers for the majority of the time that I used this keyboard. We're going to be talking about the OLED display and the firmware together because they're pretty closely linked together. There are 3 firmware versions linked in the Gopolar website's firmware page. The first is labeled QMK lamp effect. This one is not VIA compatible, so you will have to use the default key mapping as documented in the manual. The OLED displays caps, num, and scroll lock indicators. The last 20 keys you press, a layer indicator, and a couple of numbers labeled LT and ET that I do not know the purpose of. RGB lighting can be changed through the default function keys. The second firmware is labeled VIA lamp effect. This one is VIA compatible but requires loading a JSON file in VIA's design tab in order for the keyboard to be detected every time you open VIA. The OLED functions in the same way as the first firmware. RGB lighting is configurable through VIA, but it functions kind of strangely. Underglow and per key RGB seem to be separate and controlled separately. However, only the underglow settings function, and they modify both the underglow and the per key at the same time. The per key settings don't do anything. The third firmware is labeled QMK no key record. This one is not VIA compatible and has the same key mapping as the first firmware. The OLED still shows lock and layer indicators, but no longer displays your key presses and the mystery numbers. Instead, it displays your words per minute. You can also press function plus pipe in order to switch to an animated bongo cat that also displays your words per minute. I've settled onto the second firmware, the VIA compatible one, because I like having the function key on the split right shift key. Unfortunately, this does mean that I'm stuck with the OLED displaying key presses, which I really do not like. It will display your password. Here's hoping they make a VIA compatible firmware that does not have that key press display. The GG86 is packed to the brim with silicone, and that's very apparent in typing feel and sound. It's pretty stiff and pretty muted. I find that I need to use louder switches like Gateron Pro Reds or JWick Blacks in order for the keyboard to sound satisfying. With switches like Gateron Black Inks, it's a bit too quiet for my liking. Next, let's compare it with a couple of other boards. First with the KBD67 Lite, to which it is often compared because of the similar silicone gasket sheet. You really have to crank the gain on these to discern the difference during A/B testing. There's a satisfying pop that the KBD67 Lite has on the bottom direction of each keystroke that the GG86 lacks. It's hard to hear in the comparison, but it's also pretty evident to me that the Lite is louder, which for me is a good thing. I like to hear my keyboards, and like I said earlier, quieter switches like Inks just don't sound satisfying on the GG86. And lastly, let's compare it with the XM87 TKL that I poured silicone into in a previous video. Again, there's a volume difference that works to the XM87's advantage here. I also think that the tape mod is doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of improving the XM87's sound, but there is a bit of harshness to it that can probably be attributed to the metal plate and can also be felt during typing. The GG86's FR4 plate is softer on bottom out. I'll leave the full sound tests at the end of the video. Overall, this is a capable keyboard. It's loaded with features, but nothing really game-changing in my eyes. The OLED is pretty much just a gimmick for me, and the Sangan bottom row is nice to look at, but not essential. I also encountered quite a lot of issues, but nothing major. The mounting is very stiff, but not harsh on bottom out. Sound is a little too muted for my liking, making it incompatible with quieter switches. Should you buy this board, you're going to have to consider the features it has and whether or not they're important to you. If you're looking for ISO and the Sangan bottom row, I don't think there's any other option at this price range in the TKL form factor. Multi-layout hot swap with this many options is something I've really only seen in the Ikki 68 Aurora. A budget TKL alternative would be the MK870 for $57 to $60 although it has fewer features. I have this keyboard on me right now and I'll be covering it in a future video. The NK87 Entry Edition is another option at a similar price to the GG86. If you've got more money to spend, you might want to look at the aluminum NK87 as well as the Freebird TKL. And that concludes my look into the Gopolar Taichi GG86. What do you think about this keyboard? Which of its features appeals most to you? Are you a fan of that unboxing experience? Any other alternatives we should consider? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this video helpful, entertaining, informative, or any other positive adjective, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Once again, we're ending with some full sound tests. If you'd like to help the channel survive, please stay until the end of those. Thank you so much for watching.